All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If everybody get to grab a seat, we'd be more than happy to start moving forward. This is the City of West Covina's second proposed fiscal year 2017-2018 budget study session. My name is Chris Freeland. I am your city manager. I'm also here with some of our city staff who will be helping put together the budget presentation. But before I do so, Madam City Clerk, do you want to do a quick roll call?
Yes. Councilman Johnson. Here. Councilmember Toma. Here. Councilman Wu.
Oh, he's here.
Mayor Pro Tem Spence. Here. And Mayor Warshaw. Here.
Thank you. Just a couple housekeeping items. One is tonight's meeting is going out live on YouTube as well as on the city's SIRE website service, so it's on both platforms. In addition, as a reminder to folks, we are planning on having a budget study session next Wednesday evening at 6:30 with the City Council to give some direction on some of the recommendations that will be presented to them this evening and to the public for consideration. What we want to have tonight's budget study session it's really to be a follow-up and to share with the community the progress the city staff has made since our last budget study session, and also to include comments and some of the recommendations that we did receive from the public. Now, as we go through this, there has been some comments and concerns regarding the budget deficit that was presented a couple weeks ago. Mind you, that was the preliminary budget discussion. That happens every year when you start a budget discussion, is you have a certain number where you're at, and you either increase revenues, make cuts in order to adopt your budget at the appropriate time. So tonight you're going to see some significant changes in to help reduce the budget deficit that we projected early on, a little over $6 million. And I do remind folks is that, this is part of what's important about transparency. The community has asked for transparency, and the community has asked for these budget study sessions. By doing so, that means preliminary numbers are going to be pretty significant because city staff hasn't had the opportunity to start taking feedback from the council or from the community to make the necessary cuts or to look at revenue enhancements as we move forward. So I want to make sure that people understand that when we get to discussion where that $6 million initial number came from, we'll be able to clearly define that for the public and then tell you how we as a staff move forward on the proposed cuts and revenue enhancements that we may be looking at. So with that, what I wanted to do is I want to turn it over to our finance director, Krista Bahajar, who will give a brief overview and some PowerPoint slides. What we plan to do is have some open dialogue and discussion, and at the conclusion, we'll be more than happy to take any questions and comments from the public. I do see a couple of yellow cards here. The intent is to have open dialogue. If we need to control speakers, we do have a clock, but the idea is if you can keep your comments short, we won't have to use the clock. With that, I'll turn it over to Krista, who will begin with the presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members, members of the public. Tonight, we will be presenting the second community budget workshop. The priorities for the 17-18 budget are to maintain the 20% fund balance reserve that we've built up, and also to close the general fund operating gap. Ways we can do this are seek new revenue opportunities, reduce expenditures, which would lead to impacts on service, or use fund balance. So this is a bar chart that is showing a little bit of history, a citywide comparison. This is all city funds, general fund, all the special capital projects and whatnot. Kind of shows that, back in 13-14, revenues were outpacing expenditures, but you can see that has been starting to change. This shows the general fund comparison of revenues to expenditures. And you can see that change started to happen where expenditures started to outpace revenue in 15-16, and it's been growing. Next shows our general fund revenues, that property taxes are 39% of the general fund budget and sales taxes 27%. Our other taxes make up another 13, and then the spread for all the other different fees and revenue that we get from the city, or at the city. This shows a trend in our property taxes. Property taxes have been slowly increasing, and it's something that even in 17-18, we're still seeing growth, so that's good. Our sales tax trend, we have in 15-16, you'll see a spike. That's because of the end of triple flip. We got a large one-time payment, and then you can see it go back to more the natural trend. But sales tax is stabilizing. It's not really increasing anymore. So that's part of the problem that we're having. This shows where our general fund balance, where we're estimating it to be at the beginning of the 17-18 budget. You'll see the operating revenues underperforming compared to the expenditures. So we're at a almost $5.3 million operating deficit. We have transfers of $1 million, which, and some of the RDA advances were paid off, so that has reduced the non-spendable. And our unassigned fund balance, we're projecting to be at $7.5 million, which puts our reserve at 11%, where we really want to be at 20%. When we had our last budget meeting, we were at a budget deficit of about $6.1 million. So we tried to put together to explain what makes up, how did we get into that situation. So in the past 2 years, we'd put in a 3% anticipated salary savings. So taking that out, it's almost $1.5 million. Our PERS increases are estimated at $1.8 million. The elimination of the SAFER grant is causing us to absorb $1.2 million in fire personnel costs into the general fund. And then there are other increased personnel and supply costs. So the normal increases, healthcare, things like that, and maintenance, like contracts that we have throughout the city. So the challenges that we are facing are maintaining that current level of service that everyone is used to. There's always the desire to hire more police officers, the expansion of EMS services, updating park equipment and playing fields, replacing aging infrastructure and vehicles, the potential elimination of CDBG-funded programs, and that OPEB liability that would be good to try to work on funding. This is a chart showing you our major revenues. So property tax and sales tax revenue is in blue compared to our police and fire expenditures, which is in kind of red, over the past few years, to show you that our public safety costs exceed just property tax and sales tax revenues, have and continue to increase. This is our number of funded positions. Just shows it has only slightly increased, and as I said at the last budget meeting, back in 05-06, staffing was at 438 full-time employees. So at the last budget workshop, we started off with that $6.1 million operating deficit. We had some revenue and expenditure ideas that we incorporated, and then there's also some changes in fleet operation that we've incorporated in to get us at the 5.2 that we're at going into this meeting. So some items that are potential ways that we can close this gap. The Athens annual contribution of $300,000. If we implement an Athens enforcement program, that could bring in $200,000 in revenue. If we shared the cost of the crossing guards with the schools, that could bring in $100,000. If we started charging sports groups for field lighting costs, that would be approximately $150,000. If we chose not to fund the vehicle replacement charges for the fiscal year, that would save $253,000. If we implemented a street sweeping fee, that would cover $490,000 of our costs. If we implemented canvassing for animal control, that could bring in $200,000, which would bring us to a almost $6 million operating deficit. So if we implemented 5% cuts across all departments, that would be almost 3.2 million, but we'd still have about 400,000 that we'd have to look into finding ways to save money or increase revenue. So it's just a snapshot of our general fund expenditures by department. Police and fire, we're at, getting close to 74% of the general fund budget. Support services is like city clerk, city attorney, city manager, city council, finance, HR, IT, all those central services. So, 5% cuts across all departments. This is what it would look like. The city council and city manager's office, it's almost 75,000. City clerk is almost 20,000. Finance, IT, HR, and risk is 172,000. Planning at 35. Police department at almost 6 million. Fire at 930,000. Public works 234,000, and community services would be 142,000. So some ideas of some things to cut. If we eliminated the aquatics program as of July 1st, that would save the city 41,000. If we eliminated special events, that would save 31,000. And this doesn't include 4th of July and summer concerts and movies in the parks. There have been some cuts with that, and that depends on the Athens money. Could go one way or the other. If we froze current vacant positions, that would save 246,000. This comes from feedback from the last meeting, non-essential travel. If we froze that, that would save 75,000 across all departments. If we cut the commission and elected official, like the treasurer budgets, that would be 6,875. And that's not their stipend, it's their travel, their training, things like that. If we cut the city council allowance to 1,500, that would save 16,000. So some things that are programmed into the capital improvement program, we're anticipating if we issue bonds for the Glendora Avenue project, they're anticipating that we might spend $5 million in expenditures this first year. We have money programmed for Azusa Avenue street rehab, residential street rehab, drought-tolerant landscaping, sewer projects, concrete repair, and flashing beacons. This is a mixture of mostly special funds that are covering these projects. And I'll turn it over to Chris for any questions.
Before we do, just a couple points that we'd like to point out. If we can go back to the slide of the differences between public safety funding and the major revenue sources. We just wanted to show that for the public's benefit, that it seems to be, it's a growing trend where the city's two major revenue sources are not able to keep up with the additional costs for public safety. And that's a combination of us as a city adding more personnel. That's something we've been adding as additional police officers over the last few years. But then also increased costs, as we've had that discussion in the past about pension costs and whatnot. This last week at the city council authorized us to move forward with what's called impasse procedures with the West Covina Firefighters Association, which is changing the staffing in the fire department, where we will be not utilizing all, so let me backtrack a second. What we're looking to do is at all 5 fire stations, we have a fire engine at each of those stations. Those are what everybody calls fire trucks, okay? There's also another piece of apparatus called a ladder truck that you see out in the community, which has a firefighter in the back driving it. So what the city's proposing to do is that one of those fire engines and that ladder truck are being combined into one new apparatus called a Quint. It serves the purpose of both those equipment. Now by doing so, the city is able to reduce the city's staffing in the fire department by a total of 6 individuals, which means 2 individuals on any given day less in the community. The Quint will still be able to respond to medical calls and fire calls. And that's important to the city because when you look at the ladder truck by itself, it does not have the ability to pump water. So if it arrives first to the scene of a fire, it can't do a whole lot to put that fire out. Whereas the Quint, if it arrives on the scene first, the firefighters can start laying on the hose and actually putting out the fire with that piece of apparatus. So that is an upgrade versus what the city had a few years ago. And what I mean by that is prior to the grants that the city got over the last few years for the SAFER grant, if we go back to 2010, 2011, the fire department was staffed at 60 individuals. That was a decrease from 75 the year before. That's a pretty significant cut in staffing. With the addition of the SAFER grant over the last really 7 years, the staffing in the fire department has fluctuated up and down between 72 and 78. And what is being proposed moving forward is the staffing of 69, which is still 9 greater than what it was back in 2010, 2011, when that grant, before we applied for that SAFER grant. So that does mean that, while there are changes to the fire department, it's not nearly as bad as it was back in 2010, 2011. In addition to having the Quint, we also have one additional rescue ambulance in the community than we did back then. So we do have a little bit better quality of service than we received back then. I know that's been a lot of comments folks have been asking since last week's meeting on exactly what does that mean, because unfortunately the message that got out there is that the city was going to shut down Fire Station 4 is some of the messages we were getting from us, and that's not the case. If we go ahead and skip over to some of the items in closing the gap. The first item there is, of course, the Athens annual contribution. That is no longer a donation. Those monies can be utilized everywhere and general funds purposes. One of the comments Chris had made is that at this time, we've already kind of invested moving forward with the summer concert series and the 4th of July celebration this year, unless given direction otherwise. We're still moving forward with those 2 events. In future years, if that $300,000 or the evergreen is continued, that $300,000 will go in the general fund, but the council still has to take a separate action to fund the 4th of July celebration and summer concerts. Because at this time, it's not, those 2 programs for 2018 are not part of the city's budget. That'd be something that we need to be put back in. Now, we do have what's called the Community Services Foundation, where there's been donations that have been contributed over the years from the community. There's been fundraisers for different events and that. So there are some funds available that might be able to fund, let's say, the summer concerts next year. But the city council may say, some of those funds are more priority to do either other community events, or perhaps they want to use those funds for some capital improvements at some of our facilities. So that's really at the council's discretion, and we're not at that point to make those decisions. We talked about Athens enforcement. There has been some use of bins here in the community that are not Athens bins for dumping of, really for the demolition of commercial or any kind of construction debris. And why that's important to the city is for 2 reasons. One is it generates revenue through the franchise fee for those bins that are actually rented here in the community, is one. 2 is it impacts our diversion rates. If we are not getting those diversion rates from our Athens bins, there's no control on where that debris is actually going into the waste stream and to the dumps, and so we don't actually get necessarily all the credit. And if one of these dumpers who are not in Athens shows up at the dump, and let's say they have cans upon cans of paint, the city is on the hook for any cleanup or any issues related to that. Whereas if it goes to the Athens MRF, where they sort all that debris before disposing of it at the landfill. That also guarantees and protects the city for liability for any illegal waste getting into the waste stream at the dump. Crossing guards. We're not proposing to eliminate the crossing guards at this time, but it's something that a lot of other cities, you'll see that the city and the school districts will share those costs. In other communities, the school district picks up the entire cost of those crossing guards. And again, that's an item that we're looking at. Sports groups, something very similar. Right now, our sports groups get full free use of our lighting and use of the playing fields in our community. In most other cities, they are charged a fee for those use of those playing fields and for the lights. But another important thing about the lights is not just recouping our revenue, but if there is no charge, there's really no control on how much lighting they're actually using. So if they're done practicing or done playing, there's not maybe that urgency to shut off the lights. Whereas if there's a fee, let's say $20 an hour per light that the leagues are using, which is not too bad compared to our neighbors over in El Monte, where they charge $25 and they have a 2-hour minimum for lights. So those are some of the things that the city staff is proposing that the city council look at. Remove vehicle replacement. We would look at this as a one-time thing. It's been important for us to start investing in replacement of vehicles here in the city. We've seen that in the fire department and the police department as well as other departments. We think that 1 year of not funding that replacement program won't put us too far behind, so we're recommending that. Many cities charge a street sweeping fee. Here in West Covina, we do not. And what they've historically done, some of these other cities, is, let's say if they have a water bill, they'll charge an additional fee on those water bills or electric bills for the collection of a street sweeping fee. So if that's something the city council wishes to do so, that's something that can be considered at the appropriate time. Canvassing, and Chris had touched on that. What that is that animal care and control officers go out in the community and verify if people are licensing their animals. If they do not, they are issued a citation, as well as are required to pay the appropriate animal license. So that's what this program does. And then on top of that, we're reaching out to all the departments to do 5% across the board cuts in order to help balance the budget. One of the items that we're having the discussion about that 5% cut that's important is, right now we've been telling departments to kind of manage their own budgets and maintain a 3% cut. We've seen that in some departments that's been difficult to do, especially in public safety, and more importantly, more in the fire department. With the end of the SAFER grant, they've had a much larger overtime budget than what was budgeted for, and that is because as a SAFER grant, employees were either finding employment in another community or were vacancies occurred. We weren't able to backfill those positions, and that's created overtime for those 6 positions here in the city. And those are not reimbursed by the grant. So for those 6 full-time positions, they've been backfilled with overtime, which has created a burden on the city's general fund because of that. And then if we jump real quick to the 5% across all department budgets, this was something that my direction to the staff, based on the comments we actually received at the last budget hearing here, was to talk about freezing non-essential travel. That's important. So, you know, for the year, if we can't afford it, we're not going to conferences or training workshops that are non-essential. And what I mean by non-essential is there may be a time that someone in finance must go to a GASP training. Go ahead. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, the cuts across the departments. Next one, there you go. So on this one, for example, it says the $75,000. Now, if someone needs to get GASB training in our finance department, which is rules and regulations that we have to be on top of, we'll be sending folks to it. If, for example, we need to go up to Sacramento to meet with our legislators regarding the elimination of redevelopment and us trying to recoup some of our funds that they're still holding, that's what we consider essential. Non-essential would be, you know, next year perhaps we don't go to the ICSC conference that the city goes every year. And that's a tough one because we do bring businesses from those meetings. But, you know, in this time, maybe we don't do it that year and we look at it the following year. The directors and the staff, they don't go to their individual conferences. Like for myself, there's an annual city managers conference. I don't plan on going to that next year. The Parks and Recreation folks, they aren't going to California Parks and Recreation Society events. The city clerk and a variety of other folks here as well. Freezing of vacant positions, that is something that we're looking at across the board. I don't believe that was including public safety positions, though, correct? Correct. So that is non-public safety positions we're looking to freeze. So that's going to be mostly impacting administration, some public works, and I think that was it. Police department, they're going to be working on their own budget cuts, which may include police officers. A $1.6 million cut to the police department is pretty significant. And if you look at over the last few years, we've added, I think, a total of 12 sworn positions in the police department the last 4 or 5 years. And so any changes in the staffing over there would impact the number of sworn officers here on the street. And then the discussion about special events came up. While it doesn't generate a whole lot of savings, it goes back to the comment that folks made about it being symbolic and saying that we eliminate funding for all of these community events here in town. That's $31,000. Now, while we say we'll eliminate, what's that? No, it's 31,000, yes. Actually, special events, go ahead. That was Athens. It wasn't actually about special events. We didn't have that discussion at the last meeting. So the elimination of special events, now we say we'll eliminate them, but you may get someone who's willing to sponsor an event. So if they sponsor that event, we'll continue to have it. So for example, I'm just gonna throw out a number, let's say the annual Veterans Day or Memorial Day celebration really only costs like $500 or $600. If a local charity or a local VFW, American Legion wants to pick up that cost, they're willing to do so, that'd be great, and we'll be able to continue some of those events. So those are some of the comments that have been incorporated from the community. And I know the city council, and talking to them as well on their travel budgets, significantly reducing those as well, so that they too are a part of those cuts, and that's why those have been listed on here as well. I do want to touch bases on the next slide real quick, and I'll turn over for questions, and that is the capital improvement budget program. Again, as Chris had touched on, these are programs that are being funded by special funds. The intent is very, very sparingly we'll use any kind of general fund. I can use a couple examples where we have to use general fund, and that is, again, going back to the discussion about the NPDES and the stormwater permit. We have to continue to be showing that we're making upgrades to the community to meet those requirements of the what's called the MS4 permit. And by doing so, those projects can only be funded right now using general fund dollars. And so we have some funds that are going towards that program. And then the fire department, another good example is their breathing masks. There's a new standard that they have to be changed and have new masks. So the city's on the hook to upgrade all those masks for those firefighters to make sure that they have the equipment they need in order to do their job. I know there's been some comment about Glendora Avenue, and that is being looked upon to be bonded as a project using new transportation funds that are coming into West Covina. Regardless of how you feel about the new gas tax that's being approved up in Sacramento, or the new Measure M that got adopted at the county level, both those will generate about $3 million in new transportation dollars into West Covina once they're up and running fully. And so we're looking to use a portion of those funds to help with the redesign of Glendora Avenue, but more importantly, you'll see here the Azusa Street rehab, residential street rehab. That's putting those new monies into those rehab programs that we discussed a few months back when we had an update on the condition of our city streets and the need to be putting in order to maintain our levels of streets at a higher level to the tune of $2 to $3 million per year. And if we want to exceed that, of course, we're always welcome to do so. With that, I think that's it for staff's presentation. We would love to hear more feedback from the community as well as from, I'm sure the council would as well. We do have a few speaker cards, so I guess we'll take those first if that's okay, or? Oh, I'm sorry, yes. So NPDES, so National Pollution Discharge. Wow, everybody's getting to know this, elimination system. And that is that cities are being required to, in essence, treat the water that's collected from rain before it gets into the sewers and storm drains. Not the sewer, but the storm drain system. And make sure that that water is as clean as possible, or the city can be fined upwards of, I think, $10,000 a day or more. Or more, depending on the type of violation. Okay. I'm trying to think, what was the other? The MS4 permit. It's an M with 4 S's afterwards. That's why it's MS4, and I don't know the total abbreviation, but that's the type of permit for the requirements to clean up the stormwater. It's a permit that the different agencies are applying through the different collection of what's called watershed groups. So like if we're in a watershed with other neighboring cities, we all work together under one permit to try and find solutions for our region. And that's to help the Regional Water Quality Board help put those together, as well as the state of California. All right. So with that, I'll go ahead and we'll turn over. The first speaker card was Frank Williams. Frank, if you want to use the microphone here. Well, this is so people at home can hear you.
No, absolutely. And good afternoon, good evening, fellow West Covina residents and of course, our city councilman and past. My name is Frank Williams, and I've been living a resident in West Covina for more than 20, almost 25 plus years, and have been an avid volunteer. And I always like to say an avid volunteer makes a good registered voter that actually votes. And as a proud father of 5, I like to come here and speak on behalf of the youth sports because I noticed that came up the last discussion, and of course we'll have more facts that we'll try to send for you because I didn't know exactly to the extent we needed to present. But my kid's been around with the West Covina Bruins, been American Little League, been around the different parks. I'm also a volunteer on the Youth Sports Council, which is very prideful. They mentioned the use of the city lights, and I will tell you right now that I'm very proud that most of the leagues and the people that we've been working with have been very responsible with respect to the lights. The challenges that we've been having, and one of the best suggestions that I thought, especially working with Youth Sports Council, is that these days, with all the technology where you can turn on lights with your phone, and I know these gadgets are out there, and I know that with extreme planning and as organized as most of our youth sports are, especially with their schedules and practice, I know that beyond a shadow of a doubt that technology where you can pre-schedule and with an internet with a very little cost, our management can be centrally located with our lights. Because I know we have to turn them on and turn them off at Cortez Park. Same thing for baseball, and same thing with other parks. And I do know that we follow those regimen because, again, as residents, we do not want to be wasteful. And you mentioned El Monte. And the reason why a lot of the cities use those as references is because they have a lot of outside players coming from other cities participating in their programs. And we're very proud that the majority of the Youth Sports Council, I know for the West Covina Bruins and for West Covina American, the percentages are very high. I don't have those stats to specifically give you, but they've all been over 70, 80, and sometimes over 90% of the residents are utilizing. And we're talking about soccer, basketball, baseball, the different youth sports. And when we sit there and think about the awards that we've been able to get over the last 20 some odd years of being a friendly city and seeing all the development that's been going on in the parks, I think we need to really look at that cost, because you see the amount of volunteer hours that are being done for free at those levels, and thinking about the hundreds of families that are being impacted every weekend, that no cost to the city needs to be taken into consideration. And the fact that we take great pride in our parks, there's a cleanliness and there's a lot of work that's being done with nonprofit dollars. I know as a volunteer, I'm also a sponsor, and I know that we've paid for a lot of painting, a lot of deferred the graffiti. I know we've done a lot of stuff around the snack bars, and I know we've done a lot of things. And of course, there's a huge domino effect by having these families in the city, because they're in the city, they're shopping, they're here in the weekend having breakfast, having dinners, and that adds to the city sales tax dollars, because they're here in our city. They're not going somewhere else to go play baseball. They're not going somewhere else to play basketball. And all these have, all these things are how can you take a quantitative? Well, I challenge our residents that are listening to go take a look at these parks, especially on a weekend, and see how much square footage is being used. As a resident, and as of course city taxes and things that we pay for, we have a right to have those. And you can go in the evenings and see the responsibility being done. And I think there should be a look at that as far as the technology that's available to help reduce that cost to the city. But I do think that the net benefit to the city is a positive for all the financial impact that all these families, all these wonderful volunteers, all these wonderful registered voting volunteers that are out here at each and every one of these parks, because they're fully vested in our community, because they're using it and they're building that. So I wanted to leave that with that. And then one other additional thing is that I do know that we do have other people coming, and I'm working with Mike Cressup. I know that he's done a great job in building the people that are not from the city, to charge them additional fees. And I mentioned that with him, maybe we need to sit down and talk about the use from those other entities coming in, utilizing our parks. I don't want to harm the people, the residents, because we're already paying taxes. We're already trying to use it and keeping parks clean. And I understand there's budget, but I want the residents that are here to really understand that there's a high level of responsibility that's being kept at these parks. And if you just take a walk around some of these, you'll definitely get a chance to see that for yourselves. Thank you so much.
All right, the next speaker, we can pass it to Ms. Elsie Mesman, who's in the back row there in the pink.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Elsie Messman. Like everyone else here, I was shocked to hear that the shortfall for next year's budget, I understand $5.2 million now. One of the budget workshops states that the city had 438 full-time employees in 2005 and 2006, and now there's only 353. That's 85 people less. But we also had redevelopment in 2005 and 2006, and I don't think there's very few current employees that were here at this time 10 years ago. I know there's 3 girls up there that weren't here 10 years ago. As for the sports group, paying $150,000 for field lighting is a joke. The children and grandparents should not pay for something a bunch of adults at the City Hall did. Let's try cutting the lights at City Hall. And also, the increase of $314 for fees was just a guess. When there's no skin in the game, it's easy to make wild assumptions. And yes, we have been updating the city, but the city has paid dearly by hiring consultants. I went back 6.5 months, and there was over 15 consultants that, this is just for 6 months, that we paid over $357,000. This is not including consultants for the police department, because that is paid through the police drug enforcement rebate. My next item, the emergency medical supplies for the last 6 months was over $66,000, and this is just one company. Staff is not allowing the public to see what they got, so there's no transparency. And also, the LA County Department of Health Services just got $50,000 from us. Did we not just pass Proposition, I think it was H, for the homeless? Or are we just charging it to redevelopment or successor agencies, whatever the case may be, and try and get it back? Another one was the Auto Plaza sign, cost over $177,000. How long is this going to take for the city to recoup this money, if ever? The next one, I think we should put a hold on Glendora Avenue, because in the last 6 months, the city paid $145,000 just for designs, and that's certainly not going to be the end of that. And in the ambulance service for 1 year, if it's still $75 a year, I think that amount should be raised. And while we are looking for our police why are we not looking at our own police department to get a police chief before hiring a consultant for $26,000 to find us one? And we also need someone strong in our finance department that knows what they are doing. Education is a must, but so is common sense. On-the-job training is not working, so stop spending. And the word no is in the dictionary. Thank you.
All right, the next speaker, Colleen Rosati.
Thank you. Colleen Rosati, elected city treasurer for the city of West Covina. A couple things on the closing gap slide that you have. You mentioned that Athens enforcement, $200,000 is a possible way of recouping some money. Who's going to be doing that checking? Is that Athens? Is that a city employee? Is that a county employee? Do we have to hire an employee to go check those bins? And if this is the case, why weren't they doing this a long time ago if they knew that this was going on? And how could we be assured that we're going to be getting some increases in funds? As far as canvassing for animal control, same question. Is that going to be the LA County that does that? Is that a city employee that does that? Are we going to be hiring somebody, which will in turn incur some costs, some salaries, some benefits, et cetera? You mentioned the ladder, the fire truck ladder. What was the initial cost of that fire truck ladder, and when did we buy it? Excuse me. And what will we do with it if we're not going to be using it? If that's my understanding, will we still be using that truck? It doesn't carry water. Why would we even buy a fire truck that doesn't carry water? That's a question. And what is the cost of the new truck that you're proposing, and where's that money going to come from? As far as SB 433 Senate bill, SB 433, a lot of the folks don't understand or maybe are aware of what that SB 433 bill is. Do you know what I'm talking about, Chris?
Not off the top of my head, I'm trying to think, SB, about what? What's your concern?
Asset forfeitures.
Well, what's your concern about it?
Will that be helping to close the gap, and how is that money being spent currently? That's a question that I've been proposed. So information about the SB 43 or asset forfeiture, I think it's GL number 117, that money that we have in that account. How is it being spent? Can it be used? What is it being used for? What alternatives can we use that money for? And as mentioned by Elsie and many community members, excuse me, at the last meeting about the consultant fee, I didn't see any cuts mentioned in this proposed budget that we're going to start doing that. And there were many good points. If we're hiring department heads, paying them six-figure salaries, and we still have to go out and get consultants to assist, that's not good. But I didn't see that in any of the proposed, excuse me, recommendations. I'm just taking a quick look at my notes. I think for me, that's about it for right now. Thank you.
Okay, let's see. Before going on to our next speaker, then I'll try and answer some of those questions real quick. Our next speaker will be Shirley Buchanan, if you want to pass it over to Shirley. Regarding the Athens enforcement, that's a combination of code enforcement as well as Athens enforcing the rules and regulations here in our community and helping them be delegated to do so. Canvassing, it's actually done by LA County Animal Care and Control. With regards to the consultants, people have been making a big deal about that recently, but I want to share with you, when you start reducing city staffing and you still want projects to be completed, what you do is you hire a consultant to do the project, and when the project's gone, that consultant goes away.
I understand that, but I don't think we've reduced city staff, have we?
Actually, we have been. That's what I think the earlier slide says, we reduced it by almost, 80 people in the last several years.
How many of those folks out of the 80 were from the community development program?
And community development or redevelopment was like 14 people, that's it, out of 80. Okay, so what I'm trying to explain to you is that I know there's been some attention bringing to consultants, but you bring the consultants on to do the work and go away rather than stay on board. Or you're going to have consultants that have to come in and provide a third-party review of projects as well. A good example is our auditor. Our auditor is considered a consultant. You're required to have one. So there's a variety of those services that we are going to be required to do moving forward as consultants or contractors for services. City attorney is a contractor employee that's been appointed or selected by the city council. So we have a variety of services like that that are done through those consultant projects as well. Regarding asset forfeiture, that cannot be budgeted for. The rules and regulations on the use of asset forfeiture is that it cannot be used for the day-to-day operations of the police department. It can only be used for new equipment or capital costs, some staffing costs if it's related to the special enforcement team that we have in that. So those funds that they collect, we're very fortunate that they do that, because what it's doing is it's offsetting the responsibility of the city's general fund to help assist in everything from improvements to the police station, helping to buy new police cars for the department. You're going to see at the next city council buying new weapons for the police department. if the city's asset forfeiture program wasn't as successful as it is, those funds would be coming out of the city's general fund, which create even a bigger budget gap that we have. So those asset forfeiture funds are not budgeted in the budget report or in the capital because we're not allowed to do so. It'll become up as necessary based on the needs of the police department that meet the federal guidelines of those funds. Regarding the ladder truck, again, that was purchased, goodness, I want to say maybe 20 years ago, the old one. We're replacing it with what's called a Quint, which is a better piece of apparatus because it does have water. And that's the difference. So, and with the city council bought that back in December 2015? I think it was in December 2015. And it takes a year to build it. And it's actually, it was kind of neat. We saw it on Facebook in Nebraska over the last week. I guess is on the drive to West Covina right now. It's actually built outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and they're driving the truck here, or the Quint to West Covina right now. So hopefully we'll have it up and operational within the next maybe 60 days or so. But that's the reason the city made that investment on that piece of apparatus, because it is a better piece of equipment than the truck that we already have. So by having that piece of equipment, we're actually able to provide better quality of service to the residents than we had previously.
And what's the cost?
Was at one point, please don't hold me to this number, I would say it's close to 1.2 to 1.3 million dollars, I think it was. And it was, it was paid out of using debt service funds from the city's general fund. And again, that's the purpose of having a reserve in a city is, and if you look at our city's budget, what we're trying to do is close the operating gap here in the city, which is expenditures over revenues, without touching our reserves. The importance of having not just a 20% reserve, but a little bit more, is that as one-time capital needs come up over the course of the year, which they always do, like for example, we need a new roof here at City Hall. They're estimating that at $500,000 to replace the roof here. We're not budgeting for that right now because we don't have that extra money in the budget to do so. A good example is, I think it was last year, the fire department, in cooperation with Queen of the Valley Hospital, received a grant where they helped fund new Zoll defibrillators here in West Covina. And those each cost, I think it's $60,000 to $90,000 a piece. And Queen of the Valley shared half of that cost. We needed to come up with the extra half. What happens at? We took it from the general fund balance. That's what you wanted to use those funds is for one-time funds. So that's what we're trying to focus on is, as one-time monies come into the city, they should go out as one-time funds for one-time projects and not be used for the day-to-day operations of the city. With that, Shirley Buchanan.
Thank you. In the asset forfeiture, at most of the time, if it's received from drugs, isn't it that you can only spend it in a particular department, in narcotics in a police department?
No, it can be used for police, anything to deal with the police department.
Really?
Not just for narcotics, no.
I have 3 items. Code enforcement, we're looking at revenue, and of course, the fact that it's complaint-driven is really, code enforcement really never gets done. And as I drive around the city a lot, and I see so many items that do need attention, and when did we transfer the code enforcement out of the regular staffing into the police department? And why was it done?
I can't tell you as to why. It was done under the previous city manager, but I think it was 2 to 3 years ago that was done.
And does that person the 2 people, I think we only have 2 people.
That's correct.
Do they only work code enforcement, or are they also out in the police field?
No, they are non-sworn individuals. They both work code enforcement based on complaint-driven, and that's it.
And if we don't have many people calling in, what do they do?
Well, trust me, there's plenty of work for them to do.
Is there?
And if there's not calls for service, they're also being proactive as best as possible by driving through the community as well.
Okay.
But again, this was a city, I want to say maybe a decade ago, we had 4 or 5 code enforcement officers.
Right.
And now we're down to 2. So it'd be great to see more code enforcement officers. However, I know you kind of alluded to revenues, but code enforcement revenues don't really offset the cost of a new employee. 1, and 2 is we're trying to see compliance from folks to change their behaviors or clean their properties or whatnot. and not necessarily cite them. So there is a prolonged process usually before there's any kind of revenue generation from it too.
Very often, it's a political also. The city council and the city government really doesn't want to, come voting time, get a reputation for citing people. Anyway, Castucci funds for special events. Do we still get Castucci funds?
I'm not sure when the last donation was made of Castucci funds to the city. I don't think there's been any this year for any city events.
I know at one time it was earmarked for police improvements or in their staffing canteen or their where they write their reports and everything. Has that been done?
Correct. There was a couple projects that were funded with Castucci money over the last couple of years. One was an upgrade to, I think, the memorial wall inside of the police station. I think that they also helped fund the memorial wall outside the police station, some improvements. And then they've also paid for the upgrades, or a portion of upgrades inside the police station.
Okay. My last question. I sent you an email about a particular consultant, and I haven't heard back from staff. But in looking over the warrants, how many regular full-time staff people has Weldon Financial Services taken over those particular positions?
So what I'll do is I'll let Krista answer on the financial side, because Wilden does provide some financial assistance to the city, but also on the public works side. You may recall the city council pre-approved a list of various consultants to go out to for projects, for CIP projects here in the community. So what happens is we do a request for proposals from the pre-approved list of vendors. And Wildan happens to be one of those, and they happen to have been successful on being, well, I guess, the least expensive of some of those other vendors. So that's why you've been seeing Wildan on the public works end. And they also did the recent, they also did the recent sewer study for the city that's been going on for, goodness, I want to say a couple of years to update that as well. But on the financial side, I'll turn over to Krista to answer that.
Yeah, the main thing that they were used for in finance was the cost allocation plan. And you have to understand, these are companies that do these types of projects on a regular basis. They have models that they use, and they are up to date on the laws because that's their set business. So it takes a lot less time to have them put together and work with us to do that, as opposed to us starting from scratch to develop, because we got cited on our cost allocation plan that we'd been using in the past for about 15 years. So that's why we ended up bringing a consultant on to take a look and make the corrections that needed to be done.
And that's been quite an expense. I'm looking at the figures.
I think it was about 30,000.
Yeah. And they also, let's see, the arbitration rebate services. I think.
Yes, those are things related to our bonds that have to happen on, I think, every 5 years.
And professional services agreement systems, $3,589.
I don't know particularly what that.
And then these.
And I don't want to take everyone's time going through all the different
Okay.
invoices.
All right.
But the importance is that we're not bringing on consultants in order to reduce the level of work on staff. It's in order to complement the work the staff is already doing, or to move forward on projects specifically requested by the residents and the city council to move forward on projects that need to be completed. So that's the main basis of why we have consultants and utilize their services.
And they're in Temecula.
They're based in Temecula. They also have offices in industry and other locations
They do have.
throughout Southern California.
So you work with industry closer to home?
I remember working with them because they provided some consulting on plan checks for the city in the past years ago, but they're not currently providing that service.
Well, it just seems like we're spending a lot of money with this particular company as consultants.
That's the last of the speaker cards. Was there any other additional questions? Okay, let's start with Mr. Moreno first.
I remember when Mr. Fred Sykes was elected in November, in March, in his first year on the city council, he gets a phone call. And the lady says, Mr. Sykes, I've been a city employee for a long time. I'm supporting my mother, 2 kids, have a house and a car payment. And I've just been given a layoff notice. Is there anything you can do to save my job? When you put department head cuts, are you allowing department heads to give pink slips to city employees, number one? Number two, why would you want to work for the city of West Covina if every time you get into a budget bind, you're going to lay off? Well, if you're going to lay somebody off, does seniority count? Last hired, first fired maybe, because the loyal employee that's been here 10 years shouldn't be getting the pink slip. So my question to you is, do you anticipate layoffs?
Any other questions? Nope. All right. Go ahead and pass it down to Eric Melnick with the Police Officers Association. While you're doing that, I'll answer your questions. If any pink slips are issued, and we're trying to do everything we can to avoid any layoffs, that's why we're focusing on the frozen positions or other positions we're anticipating to become vacant here through retirements. Every year we will have retirements in the various departments. So if there's an area there that's general funded that we can freeze that position, we'll do so to help close the budget gap. But there is a process that the city has to go through, including a layoff process, and that's all done through the authorization of the city council. And then we have actually policies and procedures on how that layoff occurs. And so if that was to occur, it would be something that we would share with both the various associations. It's always a possibility until the budget's closed, but we're going to make every effort not to do that because that's not something we want to do. Mr. Melnick.
Eric Melnick, West Covina Police Officers Association President. I got a question and a comment, actually. First question is when you were on the non-essential community events slide, you had mentioned the asterisk next to it, which included the 4th of July celebration at $59,600. Does that include the overtime that would be paid for double-digit officers to work that event?
I believe that's inclusive of all public safety costs as well.
Okay. The comment is going to be, and this might seem a little bit harsh to you, but as a young man growing up, when I learned to manage my finances, the first thing to cut out is non-essential things. Coffee, eating out at restaurants, things like that. I don't cut out my car payment, my rent, my mortgage to start with. $1.6 million is a lot of money for a police department to give up. When I started here actually next month it'll be 11 years ago that I was hired, we had, I believe, 127 officers, double-digit traffic officers, a fully staffed detective bureau. All that's gone. It's still gone over the past few years. How much blood are we going to squeeze from this stone? You know, coming up, I believe the week after next is the 1-year anniversary of Kenny being shot in that gunfight. If we keep doing this, you are going to put a fourth name on that wall outside of our station. That's all. Thank you.
No, and I do know that as the police chief and his staff start looking at their 5% cuts, I would hope that we try and do everything we can without anybody on patrol we try to protect. But, you know, we've been working hard to get our numbers back up over 100 sworn officers. I would envision, you know, the ones that are going to be the most susceptible to cuts might be the school resource officers, for example, because that is a shared cost right now with the school districts. So we have 3 school resource officers that are being funded, 50% by the city, 50% by the school district. We do have some vacancies in the police department that we may not backfill with overtime or whatnot, and just have to cut those positions. But yes, it is every intent not to impact the officers on the street and their safety. But again, we're trying to get back to those numbers where we had the 127, and I can envision that we'll get back below 100 based on the 1.6 million in cuts.
Last comment before I'll hand the mic over to the next person. Just so you know, and we're treading a very dangerous line here, the line in the sand for the Police Officers Association is beat minimums, frontline policing. We cannot go down in those numbers. So, just so you know that.
All right, did I see any other hands? Jerry? Yes, everybody at home can hear you. Oh, over here, Eric.
Jerry Patras, okay. I think this is a better, more realistic and sad presentation compared to the last one, but it's a necessary one. I have been in the public sector for 40 years. These are not easy things to deal with. When you're talking about reducing positions, are they vacant positions already? Like in the fire department specifically, are they filled?
I just turned mine off. So for example, in the fire department, yes, we happen to have 6 positions in the fire department that have been vacant and being backfilled with overtime. As we're moving forward, we're going to eliminate those 6 positions so we don't have to be backfilling with overtime or hiring additional personnel to fill those positions.
Okay. Some of my questions were answered about like animal control and things like that. I worked in a community college, which is different, admittedly. We took non-salary reductions by a percentage, but realistically, we couldn't cut the online upfront services, the faculty, the same way, because that was what our business was. What I would like to hope is that public safety, the filled positions, the actual officers, aren't as reduced as elsewhere, that the city is looking at their non-essential personnel. I hate that word. I really do. But there are differences in an agency where you can cut back a little and not. With, quite candidly, crime going up, I wouldn't want to see the police impacted as much as maybe another department somewhere else. I do think that when we're cutting things back, I'm hoping that you have expenditure, no raises and stuff like that type of thing. I think, unfortunately, it is necessary to do some fees, like with the lighting. That one made sense to me. Some of those on the closing the gap, maybe not as high as you would like. I think sometimes it's a little easier. I've been in cities where I would be charged because I was a non-resident. Kind of accept user fees. But all in all, I think it's sad but necessary trend. And if you can just cut back a little of the consultants where they really don't need to be. I understand there's some actual need, but sometimes maybe we could just not see some of them. Thank you.
Jim, go ahead.
It's convenient since she had the mic. The 300,000 that I was referring to relative to community events was a line item in the Athens contract. It said, this was not the current contract, the previous contract. It said that they were going to give the city $300,000 for community events.
That's not correct. They were, in the previous contract, it was a total of $100,000. 50,000 of it was to go for community events, notably for the 4th of July celebration and summer concerts. The other 50,000 went to the police department SWAT team.
Anyway, the other comment I wanted to make was basically reinforcing a concept I tried to talk about last time, which is the 5% across the board cut doesn't really work with respect to positions because the vacancies aren't distributed evenly across the department. And if your agency is anything like the places I've ever worked, folks don't want to lay off people. They would much rather just simply not fill a vacant position. And I'm having problems with the 5% across the board because I know the vacancies aren't distributed that way. And so I'm uncomfortable with a rigid number like that. I think you're much better off just taking the positions where they are. You're not going to, I doubt if very much you're going to lay off anybody.
And again, that's the intent, is not to lay off people. We're trying to do everything we can not to do that. And so as we move forward, that's the direction the city staff's been getting, both by the council and by myself. I think there's a question in the back. If we could pass the microphone back there. I'm sorry, is it Ms. Delahuse or Hussein?
Good evening, Senator Delahuse. I've got several questions as well. I was concerned, there's not been any talk about hiring because of, especially with the police and fire, but our overtime is staggering. To me, it seems like it would balance out if we hired someone. True, you have their benefits, but when you have the exorbitant amount of overtime, to me, it would seem that someone could be hired that would reduce the overtime. Maybe not, but from an outsider looking in, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. And especially since we're hearing so much about LA County and other cities. So that's bringing it to light that they're in the same quandary with having millions in overtime and not hiring. And there are tons of people graduating. Seems like every junior college now has a firefighting program. So where are these people going? We need to have openings for them. And if we have the ability, it would seem that we would hire them. We'd have more staff and less overtime coming out of our budget. The next is, have there been any overtures in getting ready to talk to the school board regarding crossing guards? Because they've got their budget just like you have yours, and they're talking about the same issues that we have. So I would hate for us to have no crossing guards. People are driving crazier and crazier, and if you have to take children to school, you know well how many people will zoom past a crossing guard. And if we had none there, heaven help our kids. And I want to know if a quint, we found out, because all this controversy, it was put out that there was no water and what have you. I want to know, are both levels of firefighters on a quint? Paramedics and firefighters, do they both ride when that truck leaves the station? And if they do, quit is okay. I had one more, excuse me. I've been busy listening to everybody with their wonderful comments. Didn't write them down as organized as the other folks. Well, those were the major ones, so I won't belabor. The next person who's ready, I'll pass it on.
Let me respond to those questions real quick. There's some great questions there. So the quitting staffing is actually 4 personnel on the apparatus versus the 3 that we had on a fire engine and the additional 3 that we had on a ladder truck. So it's a net decrease of 2 per day. But what's happening is that one apparatus will have 4. It'll have a captain, an engineer, like a fire engine typically does. And then the other 2 personnel will be either a combination of firefighters or firefighter paramedics. And however the staffing is, and it could be 2 firefighters, it just depends on what positions are available at that time when they're staffed. Regarding crossing guards, yes, the last thing I as a city manager would want to do is to have the school districts find out from this meeting about the crossing guard issue. So yes, we've, over the last couple of weeks, I've reached out to the school districts to make sure they understand not just the crossing guard issue, but the school resource officers may be on the chopping block, you might say, as well, or being looked at by the city council. Fire versus police staffing, there's a couple things about that, and that is the police industry as a whole is having a much harder time recruiting. Okay, so it's very, very difficult to find people going into law enforcement. Whereas in the firefighter profession, if we have a recruitment for a new firefighter, you'll have 100 or more applications submitted within a couple of days. Those positions are much easier to fill. We're not looking to fill, well, shouldn't take it back. We do have a vacancy in the firefighters, or in the, in the fire department for a firefighter for the new quint or new apparatus. So we are looking to hire 1 or 2 additional personnel to fill that minimum staffing for that apparatus. Regarding overtime costs, this is the hardest thing that the cities are having to deal with, because it's almost cheaper, actually it is cheaper for the city when it comes to public safety to pay a police officer or a firefighter overtime than to hire and fill that position. And that is because of the benefit cost now. And we're not talking about just regular medical, we're talking about the pension costs. The pension is what for public safety? 56% of pay is now what is the pension cost. So if it costs us time and a half as a city to fill that position, we're actually saving money for the taxpayers by doing that, okay? So while that saves the city money, and that's a great thing from that perspective, now you put in a higher demand on our personnel. So you have a firefighter, let's say, has worked a shift, wanted to go home and is now being asked to work another shift and perhaps another shift after that. So there's going to be fatigue in that position. The same thing in the police department. As we keep asking officers to come back on overtime to fill positions in patrol or elsewhere, now they're getting fatigued. And as Mr. Melnick brought up earlier, then there's the issue and concern of officer safety on the streets. And I don't want to say that that's a position here where we have also, in some departments, that creates poor judgment, which could be a liability for the cities as well. We talk about layoffs, we've talked about freezing of positions. This is not unique to West Covina. I know a colleague of mine's over in the city of Pasadena. Their budget is over $1 billion, and they're looking to reduce staffing in the city of Pasadena at this time by as much as 50 positions in their community. So this is not unique to West Covina. There's other cities that are all face the same issue of, revenues kind of curtailing. We're having to face the increased cost for PERS and the cost for contracts here doing business. And I don't talk about just employee contracts, but everything from janitorial services, tree trimming, all those things here in the community that, that have contractors here to do those services. All right, Jefferson.
Thank you. Before I get to my questions, so there will be no reduction in the switch over to this Quint equipment with the fire department?
No, there is. There's a net reduction every day of 2 positions, I said.
Right. I thought I just heard you say that you would be hiring to man the Quint. So I'm that kind of threw me.
Correct. So, because right now, the ladder truck that we mentioned, that's the piece of apparatus we have in service here in the community. Okay, and what's happened is that has a staffing of 3 on it. What's happening is through retirements as well as the vacancies in the fire department, we have Chief Fountains here. I think it's either 1 or 2 vacancies that still need to be filled in the fire department as we look at these retirements. We also have a retirement occurring at the assistant chief level, so we're going to have to backfill that position. Now, if it's somebody in-house, then there'll be promotions all the way up. If it's somebody from outside, that's a different situation. So those are some of the things that are happening in the fire department.
That was a lot of bureaucratic speak. Threw me off. But anyway, no, I believe you. I believe you. I unfortunately, wasn't able to follow it. Goodness. With regards to your presentation, I was wondering, many cities right now are suffering from lack of funds because of cutbacks. And I was wondering if at some point in time we can be shown where the city is hurting in these areas. What revenues are being either reduced or completely eliminated to maybe illustrate where these needs for additional fees and revenue enhancing projects are being justified from. And I was wondering why the SAFER grant, because I've heard mentioned both from those advocating the position of the fire department and the city, why it wasn't applied for, or is it just not available? I haven't heard the answer to that. With regards to the closing the gap, Athens enforcement, you come up with a $200,000 number, but that's a projection, because I would imagine the city hasn't been monitoring these outside services so closely to be able to come up with a precise savings of $200,000, or maybe I'm mistaken. Some of the other questions I had were answered, but I was also wondering about the EMS expansion. Part of the fire department's presentation a couple of council meetings back, there was proposed a fee for ambulance and the calling of the fire department. Do we have an EMS contract with, let's say, Schaefer's or something like that, where, is that what the expansion is about? I'm confused again, sorry for all my confusions. Thank you.
All right, so as far as revenue issues, it's not that we're seeing revenues eliminated or reduced. They're just not growing as quickly as we would want to offset the costs and the increase in expenditures for the city. So those are, for example, Chris's presentation is showing sales tax is flat this coming year. That's a huge revenue source for the community. If we were able to get, let's say, a 10% increase, that generates a couple $1 million a year. Exactly, shop local. But since revenues at our sales tax is not increasing and our expenditures are continuing to increase, there's that gap. So that's what the issue is on the revenue side. One of the things that I know Mayor Warshaw has mentioned in the past and it has been brought up in it was brought up at the last meeting is West Covina is one of the only cities around that has its own police and fire department and not an additional revenue source to help fund those programs. And some communities, they do everything, like in our neighbors in Covina, Laverne, what's that? San Dimas. They have what's called a utility users tax, which is, in some of those communities, they charge 10% or more on your all the different utilities you have, whether it be gas, water, electricity, cell phone, whatever it may be. So those cities utilize those funds. Again, it's for general fund purposes, but it, again, helps subsidize the high cost for having their own police and fire services or police services. In other communities, they have a sales tax, additional sales tax, where they try to pass on that cost to those visiting the community. So here in West Covina with 2 large shopping centers, the idea here would be is that those shopping here at our local stores would pay that additional cost and wouldn't be necessarily the burden of the residents. Okay? The concern about a sales tax for the utility tax is something that could be debated because a utility tax on a city's end or financial planning is a lot more of a certainty. We know that money's coming in every year because even in bad economic times, people are still turning on the water, they're still turning on the electricity. But bad economic times, maybe you put off buying that new car or that new TV for a while. And by doing that, that reduces sales tax here in the community. So there's kind of that give and take on that revenue. On the SAFER grant, the reason the city did not apply is, and I don't believe we would have applied the last time if we knew all the rules of the grant. The first grant, SAFER grant that we received, allowed the city to be reimbursed for all overtime costs and all costs incurred to employ those new individuals. So the turnout equipment, the fingerprinting of them, the psychological evaluations for all those employees. All those costs involved for hiring that employee, the new grant changed its guidelines that no, you cannot do that. So the city was on the hook for all those additional costs. And the big cost being the overtime costs. So as someone goes on vacation, you backfill those positions, the city was on the hook for those. So we estimated that it was more costly to the city to have that grant than if we didn't have that grant in place. And so that was one of the reasons that staff did not pursue that. I will say that that was not a direction of the city council. That was something that the city staff made that professional recommendation not to do so, the professional action not to do it. Regarding the Athens enforcement, that's based on what we've seen and been told from other communities. Those are estimates that they have provided, where they've seen that these enforcement activities go into their communities, and so we base it upon how those other cities perform. And then the EMS fees, those are actually been put in place, and that is a fee that we recover when our fire department and our ambulances are on scene. And so if, for example, we brought up one of the examples of one of the fees is if, Doctors Hospital here in West Covina, instead of let's say someone falls out of their bed, rather than their staff picking that person up and putting them back in their bed, they call 911 and have our department respond and do that. What the fee that we're going to do is we're going to be charging Doctors Hospital or another facility, the Regency over there on Grand, those other facilities, we're going to send them the bill. Saying that, you need to start having your staff do this so they're not tying up our resources. But if they're willing to foot the bill to pay for that, that's something that our department will be responding to moving forward. On the EMS side, and this is not proliferant, I don't think that this is, but we have some regulars in the community, they'll call 911, say they're not feeling well. Fire department responds, and they go, I'm diabetic, I need my insulin shot today. So our fire department issues that insulin shot, takes that fire apparatus out of service, so they can't respond to an emergency here in the community. So now those folks we'll get a bill and their insurance can pick up the cost of that. And then there's other situations like that as well. Now, there was discussion that, you know, if someone just happens to trip at home and you call 911, the fire department responds but doesn't provide service, doesn't break out any of the equipment as far as stuff that we don't get reimbursed for, then we wouldn't be passing on that cost to the resident. So if someone gets stung by a bee and we come out there and they're worried that they're allergic and they get assessed just by looking at them, say, no, your airway's clear, just take some Benadryl and you're fine, go on home. We're not going to charge those folks for that kind of a fee. So that's the EMS fee that's been put into place.
And lastly, with regards to the additional fees for sports events, I understand, and it's been some time, but when I did play sports, Walnut charged for non-resident higher fees than for residents, and I don't see West Covina doing that. I know the gentleman that was advocating in this area mentioned that there was a percentage of his population that do not live in West Covina. So I would be interested in finding out what that percentage is, because that's, I think if other cities are doing it to us, to our residents, seems fair to us, for us to do it to theirs.
Sure, and the Sports Council is required, all the members of the Sports Council annually to provide a report to the city saying how many members are from West Covina versus non-members of West Covina. That is something that could be looked at if non-members, and if they exceed a certain level, they actually get penalized and fined. And the fines are pretty extensive. It's a cost of the utilization of the fields and the lights at this time. So the idea is and like in Walnut does charge those two separate fees, but they also charge for the use of the fields and lights too.
I'm quite aware of that because other cities do as well.
Right.
But I was just wondering why this city has elected not to make a difference, have a differential in terms of those that participate that reside in the city versus those that do not.
And again, I guess that's something that can be discussed with the leagues, and it's been a difficult way of keeping track of who is or isn't, and it's really just a discussion that can occur in the future. But and that's something that if the council wishes to look at, city staff would be more than happy to address. All right, so it's 8 o'clock. I wanted to keep it to about an hour and a half. Is there any last ones? Yes, sir.
How's that? Okay, my name's Craig Melliker. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. One, I wanted to address the consultants issue because I think that may be getting more attention than it's actually warranted. If you don't have city employees sitting around on their hands doing nothing, then you really only have a couple of choices. You either don't do the work, or you staff up the city with permanent positions, or you use a short-term consultant. When you use a consultant, they're going to cost more on an hourly basis, but it's not like it would be free if you staffed up with a city employee. If the warrants show the monthly cost for city employees, it would dwarf your consultant costs, and that'd be getting all the attention. So I think if consultants are being properly used and properly selected, then they're actually cost effective. So trying to encourage the city to not do something that's cost effective, I think is maybe problematic or shooting ourselves in the foot. With respect to certain things like the Glendora Avenue project, personally, I'm a strong supporter of that. I've seen in other cities where projects like that have an upfront cost, but they can generate far more revenue in the improvements that cover the cost. So they're the kind of things that cities do want to do. At the end of the day, too, the money we spend is a value judgment. And if you say, I'd rather put $5 million into Glendora Avenue, or I'd rather put $5 million into the police and fire departments, it's a value judgment. Personally, the reality is we've got a city with $67 million worth of expenditures and $50 million are going to police and fire. We're making that value judgment. Personally, I would support taking some money away from police and fire, but I would also support putting it on the ballot the opportunity for the people to vote for a utility tax. And if the residents of West Covina want to pay for the additional police and fire services, hallelujah, we can, all the additional police and fire we want to pay for. We could pay for a cop on every corner and a fire truck in every neighborhood. All it takes is money. We just have to be willing to pay for it. If we aren't willing to pay for it, then I think we have to recognize that governments don't run on free money. There is no money tree in the backyard for city council members to run out to and pluck the dollars from. That's my comments.
All right, any last questions? All right, thank you all again for attending this evening. We do love the feedback. Again, next Wednesday, here in the City Council chambers, we'll be asked City Council for direction on some of these items as we start moving forward with hopefully the budget adoption sometime in June. Thanks again.